Welcome, everyone. As the night drifts in, let's journey together through the pages of time and uncover another story from long ago. Perhaps you're already tucked in bed, take a rest, or just letting the past keep you company for a while. For where are you listening tonight? Feel free to share in the comments. I always love hearing about your corner of the world. If these quiet stories of lives once lived bring you peace and comfort, I'd be truly glad and honored if you subscribe. Let's begin the story. The story of Inuit, one of the most profound sagas of human adaptation and resilience. It is a story not of conquering a landscape, but of learning to think like it, to move with its rhythms, and to earn a life from its stark, breathtaking beauty. Before the first memory, there was the ice, a world born not of green and growth, but of a brilliant, blinding white, a blue so deep it was almost black, and a silence so vast it could swallow all sound. This was the roof of the world, the Arctic, a place where the very air could freeze the lungs and the sun could abandon the sky for months. It was a land that seemed to defy life itself. And yet, a people came. They did not come to conquer this world, for that was impossible. They came to listen to it, to learn its language of wind and snow, to join its ancient, brutal dance. They learned to build homes from the very substance of the cold, to hunt the giants that swam in the frozen sea, and to read the stars on a featureless plain. This is their story, not a story of kings and empires, but of families and survival, a saga written in footprints on fresh snow and whispered on the breath of the north wind. This is the story of the Inuit. The world was a monochrome of fury. The Inuit, the blizzard, screamed down from the pole, a billion tiny ice needles hurled by a hand so vast it had no form. It was not merely snow. It was the landscape itself, dissolved into a seething, white chaos. There was no sky, no earth, only this raging, horizontal river of frozen light. Inside the igloo, the snow house, the world was reduced to a dome of muted, blue-tinged silence. The only light came from the kullik, the soapstone lamp, a single, steady flame fueled by the rich, rendered fat of the seal. Its light danced on the walls of carefully fitted snow blocks, each one cut with the precision of a master mason, creating a vault that was both fragile and immensely strong. The air was thick, warm with the heat of the lamp and the breath of its inhabitants, carrying the smells of burning seal oil, drying caribou hides, and human life. At the center of this sanctuary sat Adada, grandfather. His face was a roadmap of a long life in this hard land, a tapestry of wrinkles etched by wind and squinting against the sun glare. His eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to hold the calm of the long summer twilights. Across from him, cross-legged on a spread of thick furs, sat his grandson, Kaju. The boy was 10 winters old, his face still round with youth, but his eyes held a keen, observant light. The storm had trapped them for 2 days, a timeless interval of waiting. The wind has many voices, Kaju, Adada said, his voice a soft rasp like snow shifting. He did not speak to fill the silence, but to teach it. Listen, not with your ears, but with your eyes, Suma. He tapped his temple, your mind heart. Kaju listened. Beneath the constant, muffled roar of the blizzard, he could hear it, a higher-pitched whistle as the wind whipped over the dome's peak, a low moan as it searched for a seam at the entrance tunnel, a sudden, sharp crack from outside that made him flinch. Atada said, in his eyes knowing, that is the voice of anger. The wind is scouring the land, reminding it who is strongest, but it is also a teacher. It tells us where the snow is packing hard, where will be good for building. It tells us where the drifts will be deep, hiding the breathing holes of the seal. He gestured to the Kullik, and it reminds us of this. Our little sun. Without it, the Ilu would become a tomb of ice. The wind outside is a giant. Our fire is a friend. We must know the difference. He began to tell a story, not of men, but of the world itself. He spoke of Sela, the great spirit of the weather and the air, the intelligence of the universe. Sela was not a god to be worshipped from afar, but a presence to be respected, a force that could be either benevolent or wrathful, depending on the actions and thoughts of the people. Sela is in this storm, Atata whispered, and Sela is in our breath as we sit here. When we are careless, when we waste the gift of a seal's life, when we speak with anger in our hearts, we offend Sela. The wind grows sharp. The ice does not form. The caribou do not come. This is not a punishment. It is a conversation. The world is talking back to us. Kaju listened, mesmerized. The terrifying fury outside was being reframed. It was not a mindless enemy. It was a dialogue. The cracking ice, the howling wind, the deep silence of a calm day. They were all words in a language he was just beginning to learn. Atata took a piece of dried char from a pouch and gave half to Kaju. The fish was tough and salty, a concentrated taste of the summer sea. To live here, little one, you must become part of the land. You must think like the seal, feeling for the open water. You must have the patience of the ice, waiting for the sun. And you must have the courage of the bear, but also its wisdom to know when to be bold and when to be still. He pointed to the snow knife, the panna, lying beside the entrance tunnel. Its bone blade was worn smooth. Your father used that to cut these blocks. He read the snow, felt its grain. He knew which drift was old and strong, which was new and soft. That is knowledge. That is listening. For hours, the lesson continued, woven into the fabric of the storm. Atata taught him about the stars that would guide them when the land was featureless, about the subtle signs in the snow that betrayed the passage of a fox, about the way the ice sang as the tide moved beneath it, a song that could warn of danger or promise of a good hunting ground. Finally, the wind's voice began to change. The screaming fury diminished to a steady, sighing moan, and then, almost abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, a weight of pure, unbroken quiet. Atata crawled to the entrance tunnel and carefully cleared the drifted snow. He pushed through the final block, and a shaft of blinding white light pierced the blue gloom of the Ilu. Kaju scrambled after him. They emerged into a world reborn. The storm had scoured and reshaped everything. The familiar landmarks were gone, buried under sweeping, sculpted dunes of snow. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the sun, low on the horizon, cast long, purple shadows. The air was so cold it felt sharp and clean in their lungs. The world was pristine, silent, and utterly new. See, Atat has said, his breath pluming in the still air. Sela has spoken. Now, it is our turn to answer. We must find the others. We must read this new land. Kaju looked out at the transformed world, no longer with fear, but with a new, burgeoning understanding. The storm had not been an ordeal to be endured. It had been his first real lesson. He had learned to listen to the voice of the wind. And in doing so, he had taken his first step into the mind of his people and the soul of the land they called home. The world after the storm was a blank page, and the first marks upon it were the long, rhythmic lines of the Kamudiak, the sled. Kaju's father, Itak, was a man of few words, his silence as deep and solid as the sea ice. He stood at the front of the sled, his form a dark, powerful silhouette against the endless white, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sled, made of lashed bone, driftwood, and cured sealskin, whispered over the wind-packed snow, its runners hissing a steady song of travel. The dogs, a team of 10 powerful, thick-furred huskies, ran with a focused, eager energy, their breath pluming in the -40-degree air. Kaju sat bundled in the sled amidst a tangle of hunting gear. Harpoons with detachable heads of walrus ivory, the cackavac with its triple-pronged tip for fishing, and the toggling harpoon head, a masterwork of ingenuity designed to twist sideways under the skin of a seal, making it impossible to pull out. Each tool was a testament to generations of problem-solving, each curve and edge honed by necessity. They were not wandering. They were reading. Itak's gaze was not passive. It was an active interrogation of the landscape. He watched the way the snow lay over the sea ice, the hard, wind-scoured picongate that was safe to travel on, and the softer, treacherous cannock that could hide a weak spot. He watched the sky, where the faint, dark reflection of cock, open water leads, could be seen on the underside of the clouds long before the ice itself was in sight. "The ice is alive, Kaju," Itak said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the sound of the sled. "It breathes with the tides. It groans when it is stressed. It sings when it is happy. You must learn its moods, or it will kill you." After hours of travel, Itak raised a mittened hand. The lead dog, a wise old female named Nuna, slowed and the team settled into a stop without a command. The silence rushed in, immense and watchful. Itak pointed to a nearly imperceptible ridge in the snow ahead, a gentle, serpentine swelling. "A glue," he said simply. "A seal's breathing hole." The hunt began, a ritual of absolute stillness and patience that was the polar opposite of the storm's fury. Itak motioned for Kaju to be still. He then approached the igloo with a hunter's reverence, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed to absorb all sound. He cleared the fresh snow from the hole with a feather, not a hand, to avoid leaving a human scent. Then he knelt, his harpoon held ready, and became as motionless as the ice itself. Kaju watched, his own breathing shallow. This was not a test of strength, but of will. The hunter had to merge with the ice, to become part of its stillness, to wait for the seal to return for its essential breath. Minutes stretched into an hour. The cold began to seep through Kaju's caribou skin parka, a deep, aching chill. He shifted his weight slightly, and the snow crunched. Itak did not turn his head, but a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his hood was a sharp rebuke. Silence was a tool. Impatience was a poison. Kaju forced himself to be still, to watch his father. The man was a statue, his entire being focused on the small, dark circle in the ice. He was listening for the sound of the seal surfacing, watching for the subtle tremor in the water, feeling for the moment of life returning to the hole. Then it happened. A soft, bubbling exhalation from the hole. In a single, fluid motion that was both explosive and perfectly controlled, Itak drove the harpoon down into the water. There was a thrashing pull on the line, which was attached to a sealskin float. Itak braced, his muscles corded, playing the line, letting the seal tire itself. It was a struggle, a battle of life and death conducted in utter silence, a tug of war between man and animal through a tiny hole in the roof of its world. After a tense few minutes, the thrashing ceased. Itak carefully, hand over hand, pulled the line. Up from the dark water came a ringed seal, sleek and dark, the harpoon head securely anchored in its flesh. Itak pulled it onto the ice. He did not cheer. He placed a hand on the seal's head and murmured a quiet thanks, a prayer of gratitude to the animal spirit for giving itself so that his family might live. The journey home was different. The sled was heavier, carrying the weight of life itself. The seal's blood, steaming and dark, stained the pristine snow. The dogs, smelling the fresh meat, ran with a new, eager purpose. The mood was not one of triumph, but of solemn, profound satisfaction. They had communicated with the world, and the world had provided. Back at the camp, a small cluster of ilu near a pressure ridge, the women came out to meet them. Kaju's mother, Panic, took the seal with skilled hands. The work began immediately, a communal effort. The blubber was carefully sliced for the kulik. The meat was divided. The hide was scraped clean to be used for boots, lines, and clothing. Nothing was wasted. Every sinew, every bone had a purpose. That night, in the warm, smoky glow of the snow house, they ate fresh seal liver, a delicacy rich with life. The atmosphere was warm, secure. The terrifying emptiness of the ice had been transformed into a larder. Kaju looked at his father, who was quietly mending a harness, and at his grandfather, who was telling a story to a younger child. He felt the warmth of the kulik on his face and tasted the rich, metallic tang of the meat. He had not just witnessed a hunt. He had participated in the central, sacred rhythm of his people, the patient, respectful dialogue with the animals that sustained them. It was a rhythm as old as the ice, the beat of his own heart. The world was softening. It was a change felt more than seen, a subtle shift in the quality of the light and the texture of the air. The brutal, crystalline cold of deep winter began to loosen its grip, replaced by a gentler, more insidious chill that promised transformation. The sun, which had been a fleeting, low-art guest for months, now lingered longer in the sky, its light gaining a watery strength that cast long, blue shadows from the pressure ridges. This was Yukiuk, the turning time, the slow, glorious crawl back from the long night. For Kaju, the change was marked by a new sound, the constant, gentle drip, drip, drip from the roof of the ilu. The snow house, their steadfast winter fortress, was beginning to weep. It was time to move. The dismantling of the home was as methodical as its construction. The precious blocks of snow, now unstable, were broken apart. The sleeping platforms of carved snow, the niches for the kulik, all returned to the amorphous landscape from which they came. Every possession was carefully packed onto the kamudiak. The sled itself was transformed, its runners now shod with a slick coating of ice, painstakingly applied by Itak with a mouthful of water and a strip of sealskin, a trick to make it glide effortlessly over the softening spring snow. Their journey was not out onto the treacherous sea ice, but inland, towards the rolling hills that rose from the coastal plain. The world here was different. The relentless wind had scoured the high ground, exposing patches of dark, pebbly earth and the tough, clinging lichens known as tuktu, caribou moss. The air smelled different, too, less of salt and frozen brine, more of cold stone and earth. They traveled for days, the dogs pulling with a renewed vigor, as if they too understood the destination. Kaju walked beside the sled now, his legs strong, his eyes taking in the new landscape. Atada pointed out the signs with a gnarled finger. See the scratches on this rock? The tuktu has been nibbled. The caribou have passed this way. Their camp was established not on the ice, but on a high bluff overlooking a wide, river-carved valley. Here, they did not build a snow house. Instead, they erected the Karmak, a sturdy, transitional dwelling. Its walls were of stone and sod, dug from the thawing ground, and its roof was a stretched frame of whalebone and driftwood, covered with a layer of sealskins and a final, insulating blanket of turf. It was a home that breathed with the earth, smelling of damp soil and old hides. The purpose of this migration was the tuktu, the caribou. The great herds would soon be moving north on their ancient migration paths, and the Inuit were there to meet them. The hunt required a different kind of wisdom than the solitary vigil at the seal hole. This was about terrain, anticipation, and coordinated effort. Itak and the other men spent days scouting. They built small stone cairns in Nuksut in the shapes of men along the high ridges. From a distance, these silent sentinels would help funnel the skittish caribou towards the narrowest part of the valley, where the hunters would be waiting. Kaju's role was to help his mother, Panic, and the other women prepare. They gathered the last of the winter's willow stems and supple lengths of driftwood. With sinew and skill, they began to construct the nerjuti, the powerful, recurved bows that could drive an arrow through a caribou's ribs. Kaju was tasked with straightening the arrows, holding the wood over the heat of a small fire, his small hands applying pressure until the shaft was true. He watched as his mother patiently knapped flint and chert into razor-sharp arrowheads, her movements precise and economical. Each tool was a prayer for success. The day of the hunt dawned clear and still. The air was so crisp it seemed to vibrate. Kaju, deemed old enough to watch but not yet to participate in the kill, was positioned with a tada on a high overlook. Below, he could see the hunters, his father among them, lying in wait behind rock blinds. They were utterly still, their white caribou skin parkas making them invisible against the patches of snow. For a long time there was nothing. The valley was a vast, empty bowl of silence. Then Atada placed a hand on Kaju's arm. Listen. At first, Kaju heard only the wind. Then a faint, rhythmic thrumming, like a distant heartbeat, fell through the earth. It grew steadily louder, resolving into a sound like continuous, rolling thunder. And then he saw them, a river of life, flowing up the valley. Hundreds, then thousands of caribou, their antlers a moving forest of bone, their hooves churning the snow and earth into a brown slurry. The ground trembled. The sound was overwhelming. The grunting of the animals, the snorting breath, the relentless percussion of countless hooves. It was the most magnificent and terrifying thing Kaju had ever witnessed. This was not a single seal offering itself at a hole. This was the raw, pulsing energy of the land itself, a force of nature so immense it felt apocalyptic. As the lead animals approached the narrows, the Inuksut did their work, subtly guiding the herd's flow. Then a sharp, ululating cry echoed from the hillside. It was the signal. In an instant, the stillness of the hunters was broken. Arrows flew in low, arching volleys, not aimed at individual animals, but into the mass of the herd. The thunder of hooves became mixed with the frantic bellows of wounded animals. The hunters moved with a coordinated chaos, driving a segment of the herd towards a pre-selected kill zone, a natural cul-de-sac where the panicked animals milled in confusion. The hunt was swift, brutal, and efficient. It was not sport, it was harvest. When the last caribou had fallen or fled, a new, profound silence descended, now heavy with the scent of blood and damp earth. The work that followed was immense. The entire community descended upon the kill site. The men expertly butchered the great beasts, their knives flashing. The women and children worked alongside them, slicing the rich, dark meat into thin strips to be air-dried on racks in the strengthening sun. The hides were carefully peeled away, to be scraped and cured for clothing and blankets. The sinews were saved for thread, the bones for tools, the antlers for carving. Nothing, not even the stomach contents, was wasted. That night, the mood at the camp was one of exhausted, deep-seated joy. A great fire of willow branches and caribou dung was lit, its smoke carrying the rich smell of roasting meat. They feasted on fresh caribou liver and ribs, the taste a rich, gamey celebration of life. The kuluk was filled to the brim with precious caribou fat, its flame burning bright and steady. Atada sat by the fire, a piece of warm, greasy meat in his hand. He looked at Kaju, whose eyes were still wide from the day's events. The seal gives us life from the sea, Kaju, the old man said, his voice soft. The tuktu gives us life from the land. Both are gifts. The seal is a quiet conversation. The caribou, he gestured to the bustling, happy camp, the mountains of meat and hides. The caribou is a song from Sela, a great bounty that shouts of the sun's return. We take only what we need, and we give thanks for the song. Kaju looked out from the bluff. The valley was quiet now, the great river of life having moved on. But as people were safe, their larders full, their spirits lifted. They had met the rhythm of the land and moved in time with it. The ice was retreating, the sun was returning, and the people, as they had always done, were adapting, flowing with the great, timeless cycles of their world. The caribou camp was a hive of industry, a symphony of purposeful sound. The thump, thump, thump of stone hammers breaking bones for marrow was a steady percussion beneath the higher-pitched scrape-scrape of women using their ulus, the crescent-shaped women's knives, to clean hides. The air, once crisp and empty, was now thick with the smells of blood, fresh meat, and wood smoke. For Kaju, it was a time of wonder and learning, but also of growing responsibility. It was during the careful butchering of a large bull caribou that he made his first grave mistake. Eager to help, he had wrestled a heavy leg bone away from the carcass. To get a better grip, he kicked at the rib cage, cracking a few of the delicate bones. He was immediately met with a sharp, guttural command from his mother, Panic. Her face, usually calm and patient, was etched with a stern disapproval that struck him deeper than any physical blow. Kaju, no. He froze, confused. They were breaking bones everywhere. What was the harm? Itak was there in an instant. He did not shout. His silence was more powerful. He knelt by the carcass, his large, capable hands gently touching the cracked ribs. He looked at his son, his eyes not angry, but deeply serious. You must show respect, Kaju, Itak said, his voice low. The tuktu has given its life to us. Its Inua is still here, watching. Inua. The word hung in the air. Kaju had heard it before from Atada, in stories. But now it was being presented not as a tale, but as a law, as real as the ice underfoot. That evening, after the day's work was done, Atada led Kaju away from the bustling camp, up to a quiet overlook where the only sound was the wind whispering through the new grasses. The old man sat on a rock, gesturing for Kaju to join him. You are confused, Atada began, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. You think we just take from the animals, that we are stronger, so we win. This is not our way. He pointed to a large, smooth stone beside them. That rock has an Inua, a spirit. It has been here longer than our people, longer than the caribou. It has a life. He pointed to a small, hardy flower pushing through a patch of snow. That has an Inua. The wind has an Inua. And the caribou, the seal, the whale, they have powerful Inua. He explained that the world was not a collection of dead things for humans to use. It was a vast, interconnected community of beings, all with consciousness, all with spirit. The caribou was not a dumb beast. It was a person, a non-human person, who had its own thoughts, its own will. When we hunt, Atada continued, we are not conquering. We are asking. The hunter's patience at the seal hole is a form of respect. The skill of the arrow that kills quickly is a kindness. And the way we treat the body afterwards, that is a promise. He told Kaju the old stories. He spoke of Sedna, the terrible and magnificent goddess of the sea, whose fingers, when cut off, became the seals, walruses, and whales. If the people broke the taboos, if they were disrespectful, Sedna would let down her hair, tangled with the broken rules of men, and the sea would give them no food. The Inuit of the animals would be offended and would not allow themselves to be caught. The caribou's spirit, Atata said, his gaze holding Kaju's. If it sees its bones treated with disrespect, kicked and broken carelessly, it will tell the other caribou, Inuit, do not go to that place. The people there are rude. They do not deserve our gift. And next year, the herd will take a different path. They will avoid this valley, and we will go hungry. A cold understanding dawned on Kaju. His careless kick wasn't just a minor error. It was a potential threat to the entire community's future. The hunt was a sacred contract. The animal offered its body. In return, the people promised to use every part, to treat the remains with respect, and to honor its spirit. The offering of fresh water to a newly killed seal, the careful arrangement of a caribou's skull on a rock facing the direction of the herd's migration, the avoidance of mixing land and sea animals in the same pot. These were not superstitions. They were the terms of the contract. They were the practical actions that maintained the balance of the world. The world is a web, Kaju, Atata concluded, his voice softening. Tug one thread carelessly, and the whole web trembles. Our life here is a conversation with everything around us. The wind speaks, the ice speaks, the animals speak. We must listen, and we must speak back with our actions, with our respect. They walked back to the camp in the long, lingering twilight. Kaju saw the scene with new eyes. The women scraping the hides were not just preparing material. They were honoring the caribou's gift, transforming it into something beautiful and useful. The men breaking the bones from marrow were doing so with a focused care, ensuring nothing was wasted. The laughter and the shared feast were not just celebration. They were a form of gratitude. He went to the butchering site and found the carcass of the bull he had mishandled. The useful meat had been taken, but the remains were still there. He saw the cracked ribs. Feeling a profound sense of remorse, he carefully gathered the broken fragments. He didn't know the proper words, but in his heart, he offered a silent apology to the Inuit of the caribou. He promised to be better. He found a flat rock and arranged the bone pieces neatly upon it, a small, quiet gesture of atonement. It was a child's solution, but it was a start. He was beginning to understand. To be Inuit was to live in a state of constant, respectful dialogue with a world that was fully, wondrously alive. The sun now circled the sky in a tireless, low arc, never fully setting, bathing the land in the eerie, golden light of the midnight sun. The caribou hides were cured, the meat was dried and stored in skin bags, and the mood in the camp was shifting once more. It was time for the great gathering. Word traveled along the coast and inland, passed from camp to camp. It was time to build the kagik. The entire community packed their belongings onto the komudiaks. The journey this time was not for hunting, but for society. They traveled for several days, following ancient routes known only in story and instinct, until they reached a traditional meeting place on a wide, flat plain near the sea. Other families were already arriving, their sleds converging from all points of the compass. The air, once filled only with the wind, now buzzed with the sounds of reunions, shouts of recognition, laughter, the happy yelping of dog teams meeting. The first order of business was the construction of the kagik itself. This was no simple dwelling. It was a massive communal structure, a cathedral of snow and ice. Every able-bodied person participated. The men, using their long panis, cut huge blocks of snow from a single, hard-packed drift. The women and older children helped position them, building a vast, circular wall that grew taller than a man. The dome was a masterpiece of engineering, its stability relying on the precise, inward-leaning curve of each block. The final key block at the top was slid into place to a chorus of approving shouts. Inside, the space was vast and echoing, large enough to hold everyone from a dozen family groups. For the next several days, the Kagik became the heart of the Inuit world. This was where the social fabric, stretched thin by the solitary winter, was rewoven. But it was also a time of deep spiritual significance, a time when the veil between the human world and the spirit world was believed to be at its thinnest. On the third night of the gathering, a hush fell over the community as they crowded into the Kagik. The space was illuminated by multiple Kuliat, their combined light casting giant, dancing shadows on the curved white walls. The air was warm, thick with the smell of burning oil and expectant humanity. At the center sat the Ngakuk, the shaman. His name was Puja, and he was a man from a distant coast, known for his powerful connection to the Torngate, the helping spirits. His face was painted with soot and ochre, and he wore a parka decorated with strange, powerful symbols and animal teeth. He began to drum, a deep, resonant beat on his killout, a large, single-headed drum made of caribou stomachs stretched over a hoop of driftwood. Boom, boom, boom. The sound was hypnotic, a pulse that seemed to sync with the heartbeat of every person in the room. Puja began to chant, his voice a low, guttural invocation that was not quite song and not quite speech. He called to his helping spirits, asking them to lend him their eyes, to let him journey to the other side. Kaju watched, huddled between his parents, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. This was different from Atada's gentle teachings. This was raw, powerful, and dangerous. The Ngakik's body began to tremble. His eyes rolled back in his head. His chanting became more frantic, his words tumbling out in a language Kaju could not understand. "He is leaving his body now," Atada whispered beside him, his voice barely audible over the drum. "He travels to the bottom of the sea to comb Sedna's hair, to calm her anger if we have offended her. He travels to the moon to ask for good hunting. He is finding the answers to why the seals were scarce last winter." The Kagik was utterly silent save for the drum and the shaman's ravings. People watched, their faces etched with a desperate hope. The Ngakik was their intermediary, their only line of communication with the forces that controlled their fate. A successful journey could mean the difference between life and death in the coming year. Puja suddenly fell silent, his body going limp. The drumming stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any Kaju had ever experienced. Then the shaman took a great, shuddering breath. His eyes focused, though they seemed to be looking at something far beyond the walls of the Kagik. In a voice that was both his and not his, he spoke. "Sedna is displeased." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A seal was harpooned, but not retrieved. Its body sank, and its spirit cries out, trapped. And a woman at the last gathering cooked seal meat and caribou meat in the same pot. The Inuit are confused. The laws are tangled. He named the families involved. There was no anger, only a somber acceptance. The taboos had been broken, and the consequences were being felt by all. The shaman prescribed the remedies. A ritual apology to the spirit of the lost seal, a cleansing of the cooking pots. After the shaman's journey, the atmosphere lightened. The tension was broken. The problem had been identified, and a solution offered. The drumming started again, but this time it was different. It was faster, lighter. The serious magic was over. Now it was time for the social magic. People began to sing, the Aiya songs that told stories of hunting exploits, of love, of legendary animals. They played games of strength and skill. The high kick, the knuckle hop, tests of endurance that mirrored the challenges of their life. They danced, their movements imitating the swaying walk of the bear, the swift run of the caribou, the playful swim of the seal. Kaju found himself swept up in it. He laughed, he sang along as best he could, he tried the games and fell over. to the laughter of everyone. He saw young men and women exchanging shy glances, courtships beginning that would lead to new families, strengthening the people. He saw old rivalries soothed with a shared meal and knowledge passed from elder to child. In the Kagik, under the eternal sun of the Arctic summer, Kaju understood the other half of survival. It wasn't just about the individual hunt or the family unit. It was about the people, the songs, the games, the stories, even the terrifying journey of the Ngakik. They were all essential. They bound the community together, gave them a shared identity, a shared memory, and a shared strength. The ice and the hunt tested their bodies. The Kagik fed their souls. It was the song they sang back to the silent, powerful land, a declaration that they were not just surviving, they were a people. The Great Gathering was a memory now, a vibrant echo in the long, bright days of summer. The social bonds renewed, the families dispersed, their paths dictated by the oldest of maps, the migration of the giants. It was time to turn their attention back to the sea, but not to the breathing holes of the ringed seal. This was a hunt of a different magnitude, one that required the entire community to become a single, coordinated organism. It was time to hunt the Arvig, the bowhead whale. Their camp was established on a prominent headland that thrust like a stone finger into the churning, ice-choked water. Here, the air was different, thicker, saltier, and filled with the booming, groaning conversation of the pack ice. The sound was a constant, low-level thunder, the voice of a frozen ocean under immense pressure. The men were busy from dawn until the long, lingering dusk faded into the golden glow of midnight. The focus of their labor was the umiak, the large, open-skinned boat. It was a vessel of majestic proportions, its frame constructed from the precious driftwood they had collected all year, lashed together with sinew and rawhide. Over this skeleton, they stretched the hides of the bearded seal, meticulously sewn together by the women using waterproof stitches. The result was a boat that was light, flexible, and incredibly strong, capable of riding over the ice floes rather than being shattered by them. Kaju's world became the boatyard. He was given the task of mixing the final sealant, a pungent brew of seal oil and ochre clay, which he would then hand to the men to smear over every seam, making the vessel watertight. He watched his father, Itak, and the other hunters prepare their tools. These were not the harpoons for seal. These were the anak, the heavy whale harpoons with shafts as thick as a man's wrist and massive, toggling heads of polished walrus ivory. Attached to them were long lines of bearded seal hide and a series of inflated sealskin floats, which would tire the whale after it was struck. Atada was the hunt strategist, his old eyes constantly scanning the lead, the channel of open water between the shore-fast ice and the drifting pack. The Arvig is wise, he told Kaju and the other young men as they worked. It is the oldest of the sea's people. It has seen generations of our kind. We do not trick it. We meet it with respect and courage. The hunt is an agreement between equals. Weeks of preparation culminated in a day of perfect stillness. The wind died and the lead widened, a slick, black highway through the jumbled white of the ice. Lookouts posted on the highest point of the headland gave the signal, a series of sharp, echoing cries. A whale had been sighted. A frenzy of controlled activity seized the camp. The umiak was carried to the water's edge by a dozen men. The hunters, dressed in their waterproof sealskin kamiks and anoraks, took their positions. Itak was the umialik, the boat captain and head harpooner, standing tall in the bow. His face was a mask of concentration. Behind him, 6 other men manned the paddles. The atmosphere was electric, thick with a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Kaju watched from the shore, his heart hammering against his ribs. The umiak slid into the black water, a dark sliver on the vast, icy canvas. It moved with a silent, purposeful grace, the paddles dipping without a splash. They were stalking a god. The weight was agonizing. The boat became a distant speck, hovering near the edge of the pack ice. Then Kaju saw it. A geyser of mist shot into the still air, followed by the immense, glistening black arc of the whale's back. It was colossal, a living island, larger than the Umiak itself. The sight stole the breath from his lungs. The Umiak surged forward. Itak stood, balancing perfectly on the pitching bow, the heavy anak held high. The distance closed. For a breathtaking moment, man and whale existed in the same frame, a tableau of epic scale. Then, with a powerful, fluid heave born of a lifetime of skill, Itak launched the harpoon. It flew in a high, silent arc before plunging down, striking the whale just behind its massive head. The water erupted. The whale sounded, its great flukes rising high and slamming down with a thunderclap that echoed across the water. The sealskin floats attached to the line were yanked beneath the surface with terrifying speed. The Umiak rocked violently, the men straining to hold their course. The hunt had begun in earnest. What followed was a long, grueling battle of attrition. The whale would dive, towing the boat and its floats behind it, then surface, blowing in fury and pain. Each time it surfaced, other boats would move in, planting more harpoons, attaching more floats. The sea was churned to a froth. The men's chants and shouts mingled with the whale, explosive breaths. It was a primal struggle, a test of human endurance against the raw power of the deep. Kaju watched, mesmerized and horrified. This was not the quiet, patient seal hunt. This was a violent, chaotic, and deeply dangerous negotiation with a force of nature. He saw the strain on the men's faces, the raw power of the whale as it threatened to drag them all into the abyss. He understood, viscerally now, why the Arvig was treated with such reverence. You did not conquer such a being. You earned a share of its life through immense courage and risk. After what felt like an eternity, the whale's movements grew slower, more labored. The multitude of floats was exhausting it, dragging it back to the surface. Finally, with a last, great sighing breath, it rolled onto its side, its life bleeding into the dark water. A great, collective shout went up from the boats and the people on shore. But the work was only half done. The monumental task of towing the colossal carcass back to the ice edge began. Every able-bodied person pulled on the lines, a human chain hauling the mountain of blubber and meat onto the secure ice. The celebration would come later. First, there was the butchering. It was a scene of organized chaos that lasted for days. The whale was flensed with specialized flensing knives, its thick layer of blubber, the muktuk, peeled away in great, heavy strips. The meat was cut into blocks, the baleen carefully harvested. The scale was staggering. A single successful whale hunt could feed a community for a year, providing not just food, but fuel for their lamps and strong bones for tools and sleds. That night, a great feast was held on the ice. Huge cauldrons of muktuk were boiled, the rich, nutty smell filling the air. Everyone ate until they could eat no more. There was laughter, storytelling, and a deep, profound sense of security. Itak found Kaju sitting on a hummock of ice, looking out at the bloody stain on the ice where the whale had been butchered. He sat beside his son, his body weary, but his spirit bright. "You see, Kaju," Itak said quietly, "the Arvig is the greatest gift. It asks for the most from us. Our courage, our skill, our unity. And in return, it gives us life. Its spirit is strong. It will tell the other Arvig that we are a people of respect, that we meet them with strong hearts and skillful hands. This is how we live with the giants, not as masters, but as worthy partners." Kaju looked from his father's tired, proud face to the mountains of meat and blubber that meant survival, and then out to the dark, powerful sea. He had seen the myth made real. He had witnessed the central pillar of his people's world. They did not just survive the Arctic, they engaged with it at its most powerful level, and in doing so, they thrived. The hunt for the giant was over. The gift of the giant would carry them through the coming winter. A new quality entered the light. The golden, endless days of summer began to wane, the sun dipping lower, touching the horizon for a few precious hours of darkness. The air lost its gentle chill and regained a sharp, metallic bite. The first snowflakes began to fall, not in a raging blizzard, but in a gentle, silent swirl, a soft warning of the transformation to come. The time of the umiak and the whale was over. The land was readying itself for the long sleep, and the people had to ready themselves with it. The camp on the headland was a scene of purposeful deconstruction. The umiak was carefully hauled ashore, its skin cover removed, and its driftwood frame dismantled to be cached for the next season. Every piece of valuable wood was too precious to be left behind. The mountains of whale meat and blubber were loaded onto the Kamudiaks, a wealth of life that made the sleds groan under their weight. The dogs, sensing the return journey, paced with excited energy, their thick winter coats already coming in. The journey inland was a reverse of their spring migration, but the world they returned to was different. The vibrant greens and browns of the tundra were now muted under a dusting of white. The caribou were gone, following their own paths south. The silence of the land was returning, deeper and more profound than before, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Their destination was not the summer Carmack, but a more sheltered, wintering ground in the lee of a series of low hills, protected from the worst of the polar winds. Here, the business of preparing for the long dark began in earnest. For Kaju, the lessons took on a new, practical urgency. His hands, which had mixed sealant and straightened arrows, were now taught to braid. He sat for hours with the women, his small fingers struggling to weave the tough sinew into strong, flexible dog harnesses and trace lines. He learned how to test the strength of a finished line, feeling for any weak spots that could snap at a critical moment during a winter hunt. Panic, his mother, initiated him into the mysteries of the winter wardrobe. She showed him how to select the finest winter caribou hides, where the fur was thickest and provided the best insulation. He helped her chew the edges of the skins to soften them, a tedious but vital task. He watched, fascinated, as she cut and sewed with her ulu, creating the double-layered parkas and pants that would trap body heat. She explained the importance of the design, the snug cuffs, the roomy hood to allow air circulation, the different types of fur for different purposes. The wolverine fur for the hood ruff, because its unique structure prevented frost from forming from one's breath. The sealskin for the boots, because it was waterproof. Your life will depend on the stitch your mother makes, Atada said, watching him one evening. He held up his own old parka, showing Kaju the intricate, tiny stitches along the seams. A poorly made seam will lead in the wind. The wind is a knife, Kaju. It will find any weakness. Your clothing is your first house. It must be perfect. Itak's lessons were about the tools of survival. He taught Kaju how to read the new ice on the freshwater lakes, to judge its thickness by its color and the sound it made when tapped. He showed him how to build a proper windbreak from blocks of snow in minutes, a skill that could mean the difference between life and death on the trail. He taught him the way to position the sled during a storm, using it as a buffer against the wind. But the most important preparation was not material. It was mental. As the days shortened dramatically, Atada would take Kaju on walks at dusk. "The dark is not your enemy, little one," the old man said as the last sliver of sun vanished, leaving them in a deep, blue twilight. It is a time for turning inward. The sun gives us the world outside, the hunt, the travel, the gathering. The dark gives us the world inside, the stories, the memories, the dreams. He pointed to the sky, where the first brilliant stars were beginning to appear. See the Tukterjit? He pointed to a familiar pattern, the caribou, and there, the Kimiat, the dog team. The stars are our stories in the sky. They are our guides when the land is featureless. We will learn them all. One evening, the first major storm of the season gathered on the horizon, a dark, bruised purple line beneath a sky of sickly green. The air grew still and heavy. The community worked quickly, securing the sleds, stowing loose gear, and making sure the snow house villages were sound. As the first flakes began to fall, Kaju stood with his family at the entrance to their igloo. He looked out at the world he had come to know in its summer guise, the rolling hills, the now frozen river, the familiar rock formations. He held the memory of the sun-warmed tundra, the thunder of the caribou, the smell of the whale feast in his mind. Then the storm hit, and the world vanished behind a wall of white. They retreated into the warm, dark, womb-like security of the snow house. The kuluk was lit, its flame a tiny, defiant sun against the overwhelming dark. The long night had begun, but Kaju was not the same boy who had huddled fearfully through the spring blizzard. He had the feel of a harpoon shaft in his hands, the taste of whale muktuk on his tongue, the memory of 1,000 stars in his mind, and the knowledge of how to braid a sinew line in his fingers. He was prepared. He had gathered the light of the sun, and now he would learn to burn it from within. The world shrank to the dimensions of the igloo. Outside, the wind was a constant, shrieking presence, a white noise roar that was the backdrop to their existence. The cold was an entity that pressed in on the snow walls, held at bay only by the fragile, persistent flame of the kuluk and the warmth of their bodies. The sun was a memory, a story told by the elders. This was Tavik, the deep winter, a season of introspection and profound social intimacy. In the constant, warm gloom, time became elastic. There were no days, only the rhythm of sleep and waking, of meals and work. The men, when the weather permitted, would venture out to check the seal nets set under the ice or to hunt ptarmigan, but their forays were short, desperate dashes into a world of elemental fury. Mostly, they stayed inside, repairing tools, carving new harpoon heads from walrus ivory, or weaving new snow goggles from caribou antler to prevent snow blindness. It was the women who became the steady, beating heart of the winter world. Panic and the other women were never still. Their hands were in constant motion, sewing, chewing hides, cooking, and caring for the smallest children. But the most magical time for Kaju came each evening, after the meal was finished and the tools were set aside. This was story time, but it was not just telling, it was showing. Panic would take out her ipungwak, her story knife. It was a beautiful tool, its handle carved into the shape of a swimming seal, its blade a thin, polished sliver of caribou antler. She would smooth a patch of snow on the sleeping platform, a clean, white slate. "Today, little fox," she would say to Kaju, her voice soft in the firelit dark, "I will tell you about the girl who married the moon." As she spoke, her knife began to dance. It didn't carve. It traced, with an incredible delicacy and speed. A line became a kayak. A few swift curves became a smiling face with a top knot. A series of dots became a starry sky. She illustrated the tale as she told it, her voice weaving the narrative while her knife created a visual world that bloomed and then vanished with a sweep of her hand. Kaju watched, utterly captivated. He saw the girl, Kukawik, drawn in the snow, her parka detailed with tiny crosshatches. He saw her drawn up into the sky to the Moonman's house. He saw the dangers she faced there, depicted as shadowy, frightening figures that Panic's knife sketched with ominous slashes. The story was a lesson about obedience and the consequences of breaking taboos, but for Kaju, it was pure magic. The stories were their history, their law, and their scripture, written not on paper, but on the ephemeral canvas of snow. Other nights, Atada would tell the old stories, the epic tales of the time when animals and humans could speak to one another. He told of the great bear, Nannerluck, who was so large his back scraped the sky, and of the clever hero who outwitted him. He told of the origin of the tides, of the first man and woman, of the trickster raven who brought light to the world. These were not just entertainments. They were the pillars of their culture. The stories explained the world. They taught morality. They encoded survival knowledge. The story of the blind boy and the loon taught about healing and compassion. The story of the grandmother and the sea scorpion taught about the dangers of the shore ice. Kaju learned to tell stories himself. At first, his drawings were clumsy, his narratives halting. But Panic and Atada were patient teachers. They would correct a line, suggest a better detail, encourage him to find his own voice. He learned that a story was a living thing, that the teller put their own spirit into it. One day, during a brief lull in the wind, Itak took Kaju outside. The world was a monochrome of blue shadows and brilliant white, the air so cold it felt like glass in their lungs. Itak pointed to a set of faint tracks leading away from the village. "Fox," he said. Then he squatted, smoothing the snow with his mittened hand. With his finger, he began to draw. He drew the fox, its bushy tail, its sharp muzzle. Then he drew a line of Inuksut, guiding the fox towards a hidden snare. It was a story of a future hunt, a plan enacted in snow. Kaju understood. The story knife was not just for myths. It was for life. It was a way of thinking, of planning, of remembering. The world itself was a story to be read, in the tracks of animals, in the shape of the clouds, in the patterns of the snowdrifts. And they, the Inuit, were the storytellers, their lives a narrative woven into the immense, silent saga of the land. Back inside the igloo, with the wind once again rising to a fever pitch outside, Kaju took his own small story knife. He smoothed a patch of snow. He thought of the bowhead whale, its immense power, the spray from its blow. He began to draw. The lines were crude, the proportions wrong. But he drew the boat, the harpoon, the great arc of the whale's back. He was telling his own story now, adding his own small verse to the epic poem of his people. In the heart of the long night, surrounded by the love and wisdom of his family, he was no longer just learning to survive. He was learning to be a person of his world. The long night began to loosen its grip. The sun, a forgotten guest, made tentative reappearances, first as a faint glow on the southern horizon, then as a sliver of fire that painted the ice in shades of rose and gold. With the returning light came a restlessness. The stored whale meat was dwindling, and the memory of fresh food was a persistent ache. It was time for the men to venture further, to seek the seal in the widening leads of the shifting pack ice. Itak, Kaju, and two other hunters, Siku and Nuka, set out on a journey that would take them several sleeps from the main camp. They traveled on sleds pulled by a small, fast team of dogs, their kamudiaks laden with minimal gear, harpoons, furs for an emergency shelter, and enough dried meat for a week. The world was a vast, empty canvas of white, the silence broken only by the panting of the dogs, the hiss of the sled runners, and the occasional groan of the ice beneath them. Kaju, now on the cusp of manhood, was no longer a passenger. He was a member of the hunting party, tasked with helping manage the dogs and build the snow shelters each night. The responsibility sat heavily but proudly on his shoulders. He watched his father constantly, mimicking his stance, his way of reading the ice, his quiet, confident commands. On the third day, they spotted it, something that made the men stop and stand in silence for a long time. A thin, gray tendril of smoke, rising from a point on the coast far ahead. It was too regular, too concentrated to be a natural fire. "It is not one of our people," Siku said. "Their smoke is different. This is a small fire, a stranger's fire." A taut tension settled over the group. Strangers were a rarity in this vast land. They could mean new trade, new stories, or they could mean danger. The stories told by the elders around the Kuluk spoke of other kinds of men, men with pale skin and hair on their faces, who came in giant wooden boats and sometimes brought violence. Itak made the decision. "We will go carefully. We will watch first." They cached their sleds and most of their gear in a pressure ridge and approached on foot, moving with the stealth of hunters stalking a bear. They crested a low rise and looked down on a small, sheltered cove. What they saw made Kaju's breath catch. There was a boat, but it was unlike any umiyak. It was made of solid, dark wood, with a single, tall tree rising from its center, from which hung sheets of a strange, white skin. It was trapped in the ice, tilted at a slight angle. On the shore, a crude shelter had been built from stones and sailcloth, and around a feeble fire huddled 3 men. They were unlike any men Kaju had ever seen. Their skin was a sickly pale color, like the underbelly of fish. Their faces were covered in matted, coarse hair, red and brown in color. They were dressed in thick, stiff-looking garments of a material he did not recognize, and they were shivering violently, huddled around a fire that was too small to be of any real use in this cold. They looked thin, weak, and utterly lost. "Kalunit," Itak whispered. The word meant people with heavy eyebrows, the Inuit name for the strangers from across the sea. The hunters watched for a long time. There was no aggression in the strangers' movements, only a desperate, pathetic struggle against a cold they clearly did not understand. One of them was trying to chip at a piece of ice with a metal tool, his movements clumsy and ineffective. "What do we do?" Nuka asked, his hand on his harpoon. Itak watched, his face unreadable. "They will die," he said simply. "They do not know how to live here. Their fire is wrong. Their clothes are wrong. They are already starving." Kaju looked from the pitiful figures to his father's stern face. He felt a confusing mix of fear, curiosity, and a sudden, sharp pang of pity. These men were so helpless. They were like children in a world that demanded the wisdom of adults. Itak made his decision. "We will not show ourselves with weapons. Leave the harpoons here. We will go down slowly. Make no sudden moves." They walked down the slope, their hands held open and away from their bodies. The strangers saw them almost immediately. There was a moment of panic. One of them scrambled for a long, metal-tipped stick, a thing that looked like a harpoon, but was all wrong, too heavy and rigid. He held it pointing at the Inuit, but his hands were shaking. Itak stopped a good distance away. He slowly knelt, placing a strip of dried whale meat on the snow. Then he stood and took a step back. For a long moment, the two groups stared at each other across a gulf far wider than the few paces of ice that separated them. The silence was thick with mutual incomprehension. Then the oldest of the Kalunit, a man with a graying red beard, said something in a harsh, guttural language. He slowly laid the metal-tipped stick down. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he reached the strip of meat. He picked it up, stared at it, then took a small, cautious bite. His eyes widened. He turned and spoke rapidly to his companions. The tension broke, replaced by a fragile, wary curiosity. Itak gestured to their pathetic fire, then to the sealskin parkas they wore. He made the motion of shivering, then of being warm. The message was clear. Your way is not working. Our way works. Over the next few hours, a silent trade began. The Inuit showed them how to build a proper windbreak from snow blocks, a revelation that immediately increased the efficiency of the strangers' meager fire. They gave them more strips of meat and a piece of precious blubber for the flame. In return, the Kalunit offered a small, shining metal knife. Itak took it, feeling its weight, testing its edge with his thumb. It was sharper than any stone, harder than any bone. He handed it to Kaju, whose eyes were wide with wonder. The metal was cold and alien, but its potential was instantly understood. They did not stay the night. The gulf of language and culture was too vast. But as they turned to leave, the lead Kalunit called out. He pointed to the metal knife, then to himself, and then made a sweeping gesture toward the south. His meaning was clear. There's more. Come back. The journey home was filled with a new kind of excitement. The men discussed the encounter endlessly. The metal knife was passed from hand to hand. It was a marvel, but Atata, when they returned and showed him the prize, held it with a grim expression. "This is a powerful thing," the old man said, his voice heavy. "It can make our work easier. But remember, the Kalunit do not know our land. They do not know Sila. They bring new things, but they do not bring the wisdom to use them. This metal can cut flesh as easily as it cuts snow. Be careful what you wish for, my son." Kaju held the knife. It was cool and smooth in his hand. It represented a world beyond the ice, a world of unimaginable things. But as he looked from the knife to the wise, worried face of his grandfather, he felt the first faint chill of a different kind of storm, one not of wind and snow, but of change. The world, it seemed, was much larger than he had ever imagined, and it was now knocking at their door. The metal knife was a wonder that quickly became a necessity. Itak used it to shape harpoon heads with a precision that bone and stone could never achieve. Panic found it could slice through tough sealskin with effortless ease. The little blade was a revolution in their hands, and the memory of the helpless Kalunit began to be overshadowed by the desire for more of their magical materials. When the ice broke up enough for travel, a party was assembled to return to the cove. Itak, Kaju, and several other men loaded their kamudiaks with what they hoped would be valuable trade goods. Prime furs from the winter's hunt, expertly sewn sealskin boots, and bundles of precious baleen from the bowhead whale. The journey was filled with a tense excitement. This was a new kind of hunt, a hunt for the future. When they arrived at the cove, they found the wooden ship still trapped, but the Kalunit had managed to make their camp more secure. There were more of them now, perhaps a dozen, and they looked healthier, though still pallid and out of place. The trading began. It was a strange, halting affair, conducted with gestures and exaggerated expressions. The Inuit held up a fox pelt. A Kalunit held up a handful of long, shiny metal nails. A deal was struck. A pair of sealskin kamiks was traded for a small metal pot. The baleen, which the strangers seemed to value highly, fetched a large, gleaming axe head. Kaju was enthralled. He watched as their traditional wealth was transformed into these hard, shining objects of power. He saw his father's eyes gleam as he hefted the axe. It was a tool that could fell a driftwood log in minutes instead of hours. But it was the small things that fascinated Kaju most. A man with a kind-looking face, whom the others called Lucas in their strange tongue, showed Kaju a marvel. It was a small, round object made of a yellow metal that shone like the sun. Lucas popped it open. Inside was a tiny, ticking heart. A watch. Kaju stared, mesmerized by the steady, mechanical pulse. It was a kind of magic he could not comprehend. Lucas also had pieces of a hard, flat substance he called biscuit. He offered one to Kaju. It was dry and tasteless, like eating stone, but Lucas seemed to think it was food. He also had a bottle of fiery liquid that he drank. When he offered it to Itak, his father took a small sip and coughed violently, his eyes watering. The Kalunit laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Kaju did not like that laughter. The trading was a success. They returned to camp with their kamudiak heavier, not with meat, but with the future. Axes, nails, knives, a few metal fish hooks, and a single, precious saw blade. That night, the community gathered to examine the new treasures. The atmosphere was celebratory. The potential was intoxicating. But Atada sat apart, his old face troubled. He watched as a young man, eager to try his new axe, began chopping at a piece of frozen meat, accidentally scarring the blade on a hidden bone. "These things are not alive," Atada said to Kaju, who was proudly sharpening his own new knife with a stone. "They have no Inuit. When they break, they're dead. A stone blade can be renapped. A bone harpoon head can be recarved. This," he pointed to the nicked axe, "is just a broken thing. It does not speak to the craftsman. It does not teach patience." Kaju barely listened. The knife was too new, too perfect. The real cost became apparent over the following weeks. The focus of the men shifted. Less time was spent perfecting the old ways of knapping stone and carving ivory. More time was spent discussing when to go back to the Kalunit for more metal. The hunt for food became, in part, a hunt for trade goods. A beautiful, thick fox pelt was no longer seen primarily as warmth for a child, but as a handful of nails. Then the sickness came. It started with the children. A fever, a deep, racking cough that did not sound like any cough they knew. Then it spread to the elders. Panic fell ill, her strong body racked with shivers. Atada, whose wisdom had seemed as eternal as the ice, succumbed quickly. He grew weak, his breathing a painful rattle. The Angakik performed rituals, but the helping spirits seemed silent, confused by this new, invisible enemy. Kaju sat by his grandfather's side in the ilu, holding his frail, hot hand. The old man's eyes were cloudy. "This is the price, little one," Atada whispered, his voice a faint breath. "The Kalunit bring more than metal. They bring new spirits in their breath, sickly spirits that our bodies do not know." He coughed, a terrible hollow sound. "We traded for their strength, and we received our weakness." Atada died that night. He was the first, but not the last. The strange sickness swept through the camp, taking the very old and the very young. The community was shrouded in a grief more profound than any winter darkness. They had faced starvation and storms, but this was a silent, invisible hunter they did not know how to fight. Kaju stood over the stone cairn they built for his grandfather. In his hand, he held the metal knife. It felt cold and dead. The trade no longer seemed fair. They had gained the magic of metal, but they had lost the wisdom of Atada. They had gained a new world, but they had lost a piece of their soul. The price of a nail, he now understood, could be a grandfather. The future had arrived, and its first gift was grief. The grief for Atada was a cold, heavy stone in the pit of Kaju's stomach, a constant, aching presence that the returning summer sun could not warm. The camp, once vibrant with the old man's stories and wisdom, felt hollow, a shell emptied of its spirit. But the loss of Atada was only the beginning. The sickness the Kalunit had brought did not vanish with the winter. It lingered like a malevolent fog, flaring up without warning to claim another life. It was a ghost in the blood, an enemy they could not see, harpoon, or reason with. The Angakik, Puja, worked until he was gaunt and exhausted. His drums beat through the short nights, his chants growing more desperate. He journeyed to the spirit world and returned with terrifying visions of pale, coughing spirits clinging to the Kalunit trade goods, of Sedna turning her face away from a sea polluted by strange Inuit. But his rituals, which had once been able to placate the weather and find lost game, had no power over this new affliction. The people saw his failure, and a deep, spiritual dread began to corrode their certainty. If the Ngakik could not protect them, what could? The social fabric of the community, woven tight through generations of shared struggle, began to fray. Suspicion festered. Families who had traded most heavily with the strangers were sometimes shunned, whispered to be the source of the bad spirit. The old, comfortable patterns of life were disrupted. The annual gathering to build the Kagik was smaller, somber. The laughter that had echoed in the great snow house was muted. The games played with a joyless obligation. The stories told by the fire now often featured the Kalunit as shadowy, tragic figures, bringers of both wonder and despair. Kaju felt this shift within himself. The eager boy who had marveled at the metal knife was gone, replaced by a young man burdened by a new, complex world. He still used the metal tools. Their efficiency was undeniable, but he did so with a grudging respect, never with the love he had for his father's expertly carved ivory harpoon head. That object had a history, a spirit. The metal knife was just a thing. He took on more responsibility, filling the silent space left by Atada. He helped his mother, Panic, whose own health had been weakened by the sickness. He found himself repeating his grandfather's lessons to the younger children, telling them the stories of the Tuktu and the Arvig, his voice consciously mimicking the old man's cadence. It was a way to keep Atada's Inuit alive, to fight the erasure of the new, silent death. One afternoon, he was mending a fishing net with Itak. The work was familiar, their movements synchronized, but the silence between them was different. It was no longer the comfortable silence of shared purpose, but a heavy, quiet filled with unspoken loss and anxiety. "The caribou are thinner this year," Itak said finally, his voice rough. The herd that passed was smaller. The Kalunit at the big post to the south, they trade for many, many furs. Other groups are hunting more, taking more to get their metal. Kaja nodded. He had heard the talk. The trade was creating a new hunger, one that wasn't for food, but for goods. It was disrupting the ancient balance. Hunt for what you need, and the animals will return. Hunt for more, and they will grow wary. Atada would have known what to do, Kaju said softly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Itak's hands stilled on the net. He looked out at the sea, his face a mask of stoic pain. "Atada's world is leaving, son," he said, the admission sounding like it cost him dearly. "The new world has a different price. We must learn the new rules, or we will not survive in it." This was the core of the crisis. It wasn't just the sickness. It was a collision of worlds. The Inuit worldview, based on reciprocity, respect, and a deep, spiritual connection to the land, was being challenged by a culture that saw the world as a collection of resources to be exploited. The Kalunit did not ask the caribou for its life. They simply took as many as they could for their pelts. They did not thank the seal. They rendered it into a commodity. That night, Kaju had a dream. He was walking on the sea ice, but it was transparent, like clear glass. Beneath his feet, he could see the dark water, and in it swam not seals and whales, but giant, metal fish with cold, dead eyes. Atada was there, but he was made of smoke, his form shifting and insubstantial. He pointed not at the metal fish, but at Kaju's own chest. Then he faded, and Kaju was left alone on the fragile ice, feeling it crack beneath him with every step. He woke with a start, the dream's terror clinging to him. The igloo was dark, the kullik burning low. He looked at his family, sleeping around him, his mother's labored breathing, his father's careworn face even in sleep. He saw the metal pot in the corner, the axe leaning against the wall. The ghost was not just in their blood. It was in their way of life. They had invited it in with their desire for metal, and now it was here, changing them, sickening them, challenging everything they knew. The fight for survival was no longer just against the cold and the hunger. It was a fight for their soul. And for the first time, Kaju felt that they were losing. The seasons turned, but the rhythm was broken. The migrations of the people were now increasingly pulled towards the fixed points established by the Kalunit. The most prominent of these was a place the newcomers called a trading post, a collection of rough-hewn log buildings on a windswept bay a week's journey to the south. It was a place of strange smells, sawn wood, tobacco, and the unwashed scent of many men living in one place. The Inuit camp that sprang up nearby was a hybrid, transient thing. There were still Carmack and skin tents, but now there were also canvas tarps acquired through trade, and the sleds were increasingly fitted with metal runners. The air was filled with a cacophony of sounds, the familiar barking of dogs, the Inuit language, and the harsh, alien syllables of English and French from the fur traders. Kaju, now a man grown with a wife, Siku, and a young son named Itak after his father, came to the post with a heavy heart. It was necessary. They needed ammunition for the rifle he now owned, a terrifyingly powerful but essential tool. They needed tea, sugar, flour, things that had once been luxuries but were now woven into the fabric of their needs. But coming here always felt like a surrender. The trading itself was a humiliating ritual. The factor, a red-faced man named Macintosh who smelled of sweat and spirits, would examine their furs with a dismissive eye, pointing out imaginary flaws. He held all the power. He set the prices for the furs and the goods in his store, a dark, crowded room that smelled of dried apples and gunpowder. Kaju would lay his stack of prime fox pelts on the counter, and Macintosh would grunt, sliding a small pile of metal coins back, or pointing to the meager pile of goods it could buy. As Kaju was concluding his trade, a new figure appeared at the post. He was a Kalunit like the others, but different. He was thinner, dressed in a long, black robe that seemed impossibly impractical for the land. His face was pale and earnest, and he carried a book. This was the Black Robe, a man named Father Bernard. Father Bernard did not trade for furs. He traded for souls. He had learned a few halting words of the Inuit language, and he moved through the camp with a relentless, gentle persistence. He spoke of a single, all-powerful God who lived in the sky, a God who had a son who had been killed. He spoke of a place called Hell, a fire under the earth where people who did not believe in his God would burn forever. His words were confusing and terrifying to Kaju. They made no sense. How could one God control everything? What of Sela, who was in the wind and the weather? What of Sedna, who controlled the animals of the sea? The Inuit world was filled with conscious, powerful beings. The idea of a single, distant ruler was alien. But Father Bernard was not alone. He had brought gifts, small, metal crosses on chains, colorful pictures of a pale, suffering man on a wooden cross, and, most effectively, medicine. He had powders that could reduce a fever, ointments that could heal infected cuts. When a child in the camp fell ill with the coughing sickness, the Angakik's rituals had failed. In desperation, the parents had allowed Father Bernard to administer his medicine. The child had lived. It was a more powerful magic than any rifle. The people saw this. They saw that the old ways could not cure the new sicknesses, but the Black Robe's powders sometimes could. Father Bernard built a small, crude church next to the trading post, a square building of logs with a strange, pointed roof on which he erected a large, wooden cross. He held services there, and slowly a few Inuit began to attend. They were the ones who had been most touched by the new diseases, the ones who had lost the most faith in the Angakik. They sat on rough benches, listening to the strange songs and the foreign words, hoping that this powerful new god might offer protection in a world that was becoming increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Kaju watched it all with a growing sense of despair. One evening, he stood outside the camp, looking back at the collection of tents and the solid, dark shape of the church. He could hear the faint sound of a hymn, a mournful, alien melody clashing with the familiar sounds of the land. Sikhu came to stand beside him, their young son sleeping in her amadi. "They say the Black Robe's god is very strong," she said quietly. "Strength is not the same as wisdom," Kaju replied, his voice tight. "The Arvig is strong. The storm is strong, but they follow the law of Sila. This god, his law is in that book. It does not change with the seasons. It does not listen to the ice." He thought of Atada, of the stories of Sedna, of the respectful hunt. He saw the piles of fox furs at the trading post, animals taken not for food or clothing, but for coins. He saw the cross on the church, a symbol that demanded belief and threatened eternal fire. The stone house and the cross were more than just buildings. They were the anchors of a new world, a world that was systematically dismantling the old one. The land was no longer just a home to be lived with. It was becoming a resource to be sold. The spirits were no longer partners in a dialogue. They were being replaced by a single, silent king. Kaju felt the old ways slipping through his fingers like meltwater, and he did not know how to hold on. The greatest adventure of his people had always been survival. Now, he feared the greatest challenge would be remembering who they were. The years folded into one another, each one leaving a deeper mark of the new world upon the old. Kaju's hair was streaked with gray, his face carved by more than just the wind. His son, little Itak, was now a young man, fluent in the ways of both the sled and the rifle. But his heart seemed more drawn to the world of the trading post than to the silent, patient language of the hunt. The final, symbolic end of the old world came with the death of Puja, the Angakik. He did not die of the coughing sickness, but of a broken heart, the people said. He had retreated into a sullen silence, his drum gathering dust. The people no longer came to him for guidance. They went to the trading post for supplies, and to the Black Robe for medicine and comfort. His power, which had flowed from the faith of the community, had dried up. When he died, there was no apprentice to take his place. The line of the Angakik was broken. A few days after Puja's death, Father Bernard held a special service. He stood before the small congregation in his log church, his breath pluming in the cold air. He held up his Bible. "The time of darkness is over," he proclaimed, his translated words echoing in the small space. "The time of fear of the evil spirits is finished. You have been living in shadow, but now the light of God has come to the Arctic." He then called for a renunciation. He asked his converts to bring forth the symbols of their pagan past. One by one, hesitant and solemn, people came forward. They placed objects on a pile near the altar, a worn kill-out drum, a set of story knives, a small, carefully carved amulet of a bear, a sealskin bag containing an Angakik's ritual items. Kaju watched from the back of the church, his presence a silent protest. He saw the confusion and shame on the faces of his people. He saw the triumphant certainty on the face of Father Bernard. This was not a trade. This was a surrender. Later that night, under the cover of the long twilight, Kaju went to the pile of objects behind the church. He couldn't bear to see them destroyed. He sifted through them, his heart aching. His fingers brushed against the drum. It was Puja's. He could feel the faint echo of the power it had once held, the memory of the chants and the journeys to the spirit world. He heard a footstep behind him. It was his son, little Itak. "Father, what are you doing?" the young man asked, his voice wary. "Father Bernard says these things are evil. They keep us from God." Kaju turned, holding the drum. "Evil," he said, his voice thick with emotion. This drum helped find food when we were hungry. It spoke to the spirits when the weather was bad. Is that evil? Your grandfather, Atada, his stories were told with a story knife. Was his wisdom evil? Little Itak looked down, uncomfortable. The old ways are gone, father. The world is changing. The Kalunit ways are stronger. Their God is stronger. We need to learn their ways to survive. Survive as what? Kaju shot back, his frustration boiling over. As imitation Kalunit? We forget how to listen to the ice, to the wind. We forget the stories. We forget the laws of respect. To survive without our spirit, is that survival? Or is it a different kind of death? He looked at the drum in his hands. It was just an object now, its spirit extinguished by the lack of belief. It was a corpse. He knew he could not take it. To do so would be to defy the new order, to create conflict in a community already fractured and vulnerable. With a heart full of a grief deeper than any he had known, he placed the drum back on the pile. He turned and walked away, back towards the camp, leaving the artifacts of 1,000 years of wisdom to be consumed by fire in the morning. The next day, black smoke rose from behind the church, carrying with it the smell of burning hide and wood. Kaju stood at the edge of the camp and watched it. It was the funeral pyre for his world. The drum was broken, not in its physical form, but in its soul. The connection to the old spirits was severed. The conversation that had begun in the misty dawn of his people's history had been declared over. From now on, there would only be one voice, speaking from a book, and the replies would be prayers in a foreign tongue. The long, respectful dialogue with the world was finished. All that was left was the silence. The changes, once a slow creep, became a torrent. The Canadian government, a distant, abstract power whose only presence had been the occasional Mountie on a patrol, now made its will known with blunt force. A new law was declared. All children must attend school, and not the school of the land, not the education of the hunt and the story knife, but a formal school, run by the church and the government, in a permanent settlement a long journey away. The news fell upon the community like a sudden freeze. Panic, thick and palpable, spread through the camp. To send their children away was to tear the heart from their families, to break the chain of knowledge that passed from grandparent to parent to child. Kaju stood rigid as the government agent. A man in a stiff wool uniform spoke through a translator. The words were like physical blows. Mandatory. Civilization. Best for them. Siku clutched their youngest daughter, Pawnee, to her chest, her face a mask of terror. Little Itak, now a man with a family of his own, looked on with a conflicted expression Kaju could not read. The day the school sled arrived was one of the bleakest of Kaju's life. It was a large, enclosed sled pulled by a team of government dogs, driven by a grim-faced Inuit man hired for the task. The children were gathered, their small faces confused and frightened. Some were forcibly pried from their mother's arms. The air was filled with a sound Kaju would never forget, the raw, gut-wrenching wail of mothers and the terrified sobs of children. He saw Pawnee, his bright, curious 7-year-old, her eyes wide with fear as a stranger lifted her into the dark interior of the sled. She looked back at him, her small hand reaching. "Atada!" she cried. Kaju took a step forward, a primal roar building in his chest. It was a father's instinct to protect his child, an instinct as old as life itself. But a hand fell on his arm. It was little Itak. "Don't, father," he said, his voice low and strained. "They will take her anyway, and they might take you to jail. There is no fighting this." Kaju stood frozen, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a helpless, suffocating despair. He watched as the sled door was closed, shutting his daughter and the other children into the darkness. The driver cracked his whip, and the sled moved away, its runners cutting too deep parallel scars in the snow, leading away from the camp, away from their world. The silence that descended after the sled disappeared was more terrible than the crying. The camp was a ghost town, emptied of its future. Siku collapsed, her body racked with silent sobs. Kaju could not comfort her. He could not even comfort himself. He felt a part of his own soul had been ripped away and carried into the unknown. Months later, a letter arrived, painstakingly written by a missionary. It was from Pawnee. Kaju had little Itak read it to them, his son's voice flat and emotionless. Dear Itada and Anna. It began, the words stilted and strange. I am learning to read and write English. We are not allowed to speak our language. If we do, they wash our mouths with soap. My name is Mary now. We learn about Jesus and the Queen. We must wear strange clothes. I miss the taste of muktuk. I miss you. Kaju felt a cold fury ignite within him. They had taken his daughter and were systematically scrubbing her clean of everything that made her Inuit. Her name, her language, her God. They were making her a stranger in her own skin. The years passed. The school sled came and went with grim regularity. The community learned a new kind of patience. The patience of waiting for their children to return changed. When Pawnee finally came home for a summer visit, she was a ghost of the child who had left. She was thin, her eyes held a wary distance, and she flinched at sudden noises. She struggled to speak her own language, the words coming out halting and broken. She called him father instead of Atada. She had forgotten the stories. When Kaju tried to tell her about the Arvik, she listened with a polite, detached curiosity, as if it were a fairy tale from a primitive culture. The deep, intuitive knowledge of the land was gone, replaced by book learning about places she had never seen. Kaju took her out on the land, hoping to reawaken the spirit inside her. He showed her how to build a small igloo, but her hands were clumsy, her movements uncertain. She had been taught to sit still at a desk for hours, not to read the snow and the wind. One night, he found her sitting outside, staring at the stars. He sat beside her. Do you remember the Tukterjut? He asked softly, pointing to the caribou constellation. She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. They told us those stories were lies, she whispered. They said they were the devil's stories. Kaju felt a piece of his heart turn to ice. The school hadn't just taught his daughter new things. It had taught her to be ashamed of the old ones. It had taught her that her people's wisdom was ignorance. Their spirituality was sin. Their very identity was something to be overcome. The school sled had not just carried children away. It had carried away the future. It had carried away the language, the stories, the knowledge of how to live in this land. It was a machine for creating a void, for unmaking a people. And as Kaju looked at his daughter, a stranger wearing his child's face, he knew with a sickening certainty that it was winning. The greatest hunt of his life was over, and he had lost. The prey was his own heritage, and the hunter was a future that had no place for it. The world was getting louder. First, it was the crack of the rifle, a sharp, singular report that had replaced the thrum of the bowstring. Then it was the metallic clang of tools from the growing settlement. But the new sound that defined a modern era was a sputtering, coughing, relentless roar, the sound of the snowmobile. The first one Kaju saw was an abomination. It was a red, metal beast on tracks, spewing blue smoke and a smell of burning fuel that offended the clean Arctic air. It had no dogs, no spirit, no need for rest or care. A man could simply turn a key and it would go, tearing across the land at speeds that seemed blasphemous. Little Itak was mesmerized. He spent days at the trading post, watching the machine, talking with the few who owned them. He came back to Kaju, his eyes alight with a feverish excitement. Think of it, father. No more feeding a dog team all summer. No more worrying about weak dogs. We can go further, faster. We can reach new hunting grounds. Kaju looked at his son with a profound sadness. And what do the dogs do, Itak? They read the ice. They smell the seal holes. They sense the weak ice before we do. They are our partners. What does that thing do? It just makes noise and eats the money we get from furs. But the logic of the new world was inexorable. Efficiency, speed, convenience. One by one, the dog teams in the settlement began to shrink. The beautiful, complex harnesses were hung up and forgotten. The knowledge of how to breed, train, and lead a team began to fade with the generation that held it. The Kamudiak itself was adapted, its graceful, organic lines replaced by a utilitarian wooden box on sled runners, designed to be pulled by the roaring machine. Kaju refused. He kept his dog team, a source of pity and then derision from the younger man. His journeys were slower, but they were silent. He could still hear the land, still feel its rhythms. He watched as the snowmobile trails crisscrossed the tundra, deep gashes that did not heal, scaring the game and disrupting the fragile permafrost. The snowmobile changed more than just travel, it changed the hunt itself. The patient, respectful stalk was replaced by the high-speed chase. Hunters on snowmobiles could run down caribou, exhausting them until they could be shot with ease. It was efficient, but to Kaju, it was sacrilege. It was not a meeting of equals. It was a mechanized slaughter. The meat, taken with such violence and stress, was said to taste different, to lack the richness of an animal taken cleanly. One day, a tragedy struck. A young man, emboldened by the speed of his new machine, ventured out onto the early winter ice. He did not have the old knowledge to read its thickness, its color, its song. He trusted the machine's power to carry him over any danger. The ice gave way. The snowmobile, a dead weight of metal, dragged him and his passenger into the freezing water. They did not survive. At the funeral, held in Father Bernard's church, the talk was of the young men's recklessness. But Kaju heard the deeper truth. They had not died because they were reckless. They had died because they were ignorant. They had traded the wisdom of their ancestors for the power of a machine, and the land had exacted its price. That evening, Kaju stood with his son by the dog team. The animals were curled up, peaceful in the cold. The only sound was the wind and their quiet breathing. The machine is fast, Itak, Kaju said, his voice quiet. But it is deaf and dumb. It does not love you. It does not warn you. It only consumes. It consumes fuel, and it consumes the knowledge of how to live here. When the fuel is gone, or the machine breaks, what is left? A man who does not know his land is a man already dead. Little Itak kicked at the snow, his face a conflict of frustration and grudging understanding. The world is different now, Father. We cannot live in the old way. We do not have to live entirely in the old way, Kaju conceded, a monumental admission for him. But we cannot forget it. The machine is a tool, but the dog team is a partner. Do not sell your partners for a tool that will break and leave you alone in the silence. He turned and walked into his house, leaving his son with the quiet, living presence of the dogs. The sound of the engine was the sound of the future, a loud, impatient roar. But Kaju knew that underneath it all, the land was still there, silent, powerful, and waiting. And it would only speak to those who knew how to listen. Kaju was an old man now. His back was bent, his steps slow, but his eyes still held the sharp, observing light of a hunter. The world around him was almost unrecognizable. The transient camp was now a permanent settlement called Kanja Clinic on the government maps. A cluster of prefabricated houses, a diesel-powered generator that chugged day and night, a nursing station, and a school with a chain-link fence. The Ilu was a memory, a thing shown to children in picture books. His daughter, Pawnee, who now insisted on being called Mary, lived in a government house with her own children. She worked as a cleaner at the nursing station. She spoke English to her kids, and they answered in kind, their Inuktitut a halting secondary language. The cycle of loss was complete. Yet a new wind was beginning to blow, a wind of a different kind of change. Young people, Mary's age and younger, who had been through the residential schools, were coming back from universities in the South. They returned with a fire in their eyes, but it was not the fire of the Kalunit. It was a fire of rediscovery. They were angry. They had been taught to be ashamed of who they were, and now they were reclaiming it with a furious pride. They took our land and called it Crown Land, she would say, her voice ringing in the hall. They took our children and called it education. They took our way of life and called it progress. But it was not given. They held meetings in the community hall, a flat-roofed building that smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Kaju would go and sit in the back, listening. They used words he didn't understand: sovereignty, self-determination, land claims. But the intent behind the words was clear. It was a fight to get back what had been taken. A young woman named Sandra, the granddaughter of one of Kaju's old hunting partners, was often the one speaking. She had a lawyer's mind and a warrior's heart. It was stolen, and we are here to take it back, not with guns, but with the law they brought with them. They were talking about a treaty, a modern comtale with the Canadian government. They were mapping the land, not with story knives, but with satellites and legal documents, recording the traditional place names, the hunting grounds, the stories that belonged to every river and hill. They were using the tools of the new world to protect the values of the old. One evening, Sandra came to visit Kaju in his small, cluttered house. She brought a large map and spread it on his table. "Uncle Kaju," she said, using the term of respect for an elder, "we need your memory. We need the stories. We need to show them that this land has never been empty, that it has always had owners, that it has always had a name." She pointed to a bay on the map. "What is the story of this place?" Kaju looked at the squiggly lines and felt a lifetime of resistance. This was not his way. The land was not lines on paper. It was the feel of the snow, the taste of the air, the memory in his bones. But he looked at Sandra's determined face, at the fire of a new generation refusing to be extinguished. He saw in her the spirit of Atada, the fighting will of Itak, the stolen voice of Pani, all combined into a single, powerful force. He took a deep breath. He pointed a gnarled finger at the bay. "That place," he said, his voice gaining strength as he slipped into the old language. "We call it Terrierjuk, the place of the big shadow. My father, Itak, harpooned his first bowhead whale there. The spirit of the whale was strong that day. It taught him respect." He then told her the story, the whole story, just as Atada would have. Sandra listened, her tape recorder whirring softly, her pen flying across a notepad. She was not just collecting data, she was receiving a soul. For weeks, this became their ritual. Kaju would walk the map with his memory, telling the stories of the caribou crossings, the seal nurseries, the sacred places where the Inuit were strong. He felt a strange, new hope. The stories, which had been declared lies and superstitions, were now being written down as evidence. The wisdom of the land was becoming a legal argument. The fight was far from over. There were lawyers in distant cities, politicians who did not care. But something had shifted. The story knife had been replaced by the tape recorder, the kagik by the community hall, but the purpose was the same, to ensure the survival of the people. Kaju was no longer just a relic of a dying past. He had become a library, a living archive. His memory was a weapon in the hands of his grandchildren. The long silence was ending. The Inuit were finding their voice again, and they were using it to sing an old, old song of belonging to a land that the world had called empty, but which had always been and would always be home. The settlement of Kanjiklinik was a place of jarring contrasts. Prefab houses, painted in cheerful, government-issue colors, sat beside the rusting hulks of snowmobiles. The constant thrum of the diesel generator was the new heartbeat of the community, a sound as ever-present as the wind. And on nearly every roof, a stark, white satellite dish pointed its face to the southern sky, a mechanical flower seeking invisible signals. Inside Kaju's small government house, the world outside poured in through a flickering television screen. His grandchildren, who called him Ananatsiak, dear grandfather, to bridge the gap between the old word and their new world, were glued to it. They watched cartoons from America, music videos from Europe, a dizzying parade of images and sounds that had no connection to the land outside their window. They saw worlds of endless summer, of cities that scraped the sky, of a reality so alien it might as well have been from the moon. Kaju would watch them, his heart a tangled knot of emotions. The screen was a thief. It stole their attention from the stories he tried to tell, from the subtle lessons of the land. They could name cartoon characters, but struggled to identify the different types of snow. They knew the lyrics to pop songs, but had forgotten the old Aiya songs of the hunt. Yet, the satellite dish was also a window. It was through this window that his granddaughter, Sandra's young cousin Lena, saw something that would change her life. She was watching a documentary about indigenous peoples in the Amazon fighting to protect their rainforest. She saw their painted faces, their ceremonies, their connection to a land that was also under threat. And she saw the power of their culture as a tool of resistance. She came to Kaju, her eyes wide with a new kind of excitement. Ananatsiak, she said, they're like us. They're using their old ways to fight the new world. They're not hiding it. They're showing it to everyone. This was a new thought. For Lena's generation, the old ways had been something hidden, something their parents and grandparents were ashamed of, a past to be overcome. But on the television, she saw that tradition could be a source of power, not shame. Inspired, Lena, with the fierce energy of youth, started a project. She went to the elders, to Kaju, to the few who still remembered. She asked them not just for stories for the land claim, but for the skills. She wanted to learn how to sew sealskin hammocks. She wanted to learn how to build a proper kamudiak. She wanted to learn the songs. At first, there was resistance. The old pain ran deep. But Kaju saw the pure, uncynical hunger in Lena's eyes. It was the same hunger he had seen in his own eyes as a boy, listening to Atada. He agreed to help. They didn't have a proper kagik, so they used the community hall. It was a sterile space, with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors, a far cry from the warm, smoky intimacy of the snow house. But they pushed the tables aside. Kaju brought out an old drum, one he had secretly kept, not the powerful kill out of the Angakik, but a smaller, family drum. Its skin was old and needed tightening. Together, they worked on it, heating it, stretching it, the process itself a lesson in patience and care. When it was ready, Kaju showed Lena the basic beat. Boom, boom, boom. The sound was hesitant at first, then grew stronger, filling the artificial space with a rhythm that was thousands of years old. It fell out of place, and yet it felt like a homecoming. He taught her a simple song, a welcoming song for the spring sun. His old voice, raspy but sure, rose in the familiar chant. Lena's younger voice joined in, tentative at first, then gaining confidence. Other young people, drawn by the sound, peeked in, then joined. They were clumsy, their movements unsure, but they were trying. It was not the same. The context was wrong. The knowledge was fragmented. They were learning their culture as a performance, a series of steps and words, rather than as a lived, breathing reality. They were reassembling a skeleton, but the spirit was hard to find. But as Kaju watched them, he saw something miraculous. The flickering, distracting light of the television was forgotten. The hypnotic pull of the satellite signal was broken. For these few hours, the community hall was not a government building. It was a sanctuary. The drumbeat was a pulse that connected them to their grandparents, to the hunters on the ice, to the seamstresses in the igloo. Lena, her forehead beaded with sweat from the effort of drumming, looked at Kaju and smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "It feels right, Ananatsiak," she said. Kaju nodded, a slow, deep emotion welling within him. The satellite dish brought the world to them, and in doing so, it had shown them what they were in danger of losing. It had created a void, and now the young people were trying to fill it. The drum was not as powerful as it once was. The songs were not as numerous, but the beat went on. It was a different kind of hunt now, not for seal or caribou, but for identity. They were using the tools of the modern world, the community hall, the internet, the land claim process, to rediscover the tools of the ancient one. The signal from the south had shown them a reflection of their own loss, and in response, they were raising their own signal, a drumbeat of memory, a song of return. The circle, though bent and broken, was trying to close. The Arctic was warming. The elders, the human barometers of the land, had been saying it for years in whispers, their observations dismissed as the ramblings of old men. But now, the evidence was undeniable, even to the Kalunit scientists who came with their instruments and their worried faces. The ice was thinner, forming later and breaking up earlier. The permafrost, the eternally frozen ground that was the foundation of the tundra, was softening, causing houses to slump and roads to buckle. The world was becoming unmoored. For Kaju, the changing climate was a personal, visceral betrayal. The knowledge he had spent a lifetime accumulating, the reading of the ice, the prediction of weather patterns, the understanding of animal migrations, was becoming obsolete. The old maps in his mind were being redrawn by a force more powerful than any he had known. He stood with Lena at the edge of the shore-fast ice. It was late spring, but the ice was already rotten, a porous, gray sponge that sagged under its own weight. In the distance, they could see open water where there should have been a solid white plain. "The Inuit are harder to find now," Kaju said, his voice heavy. "The ice is too unstable for the seals to maintain them. They are confused. The rhythm is broken." Lena, now a young woman working with the local Hunters and Trappers Association, nodded grimly. She had data on her laptop that confirmed what her grandfather saw with his eyes. The graphs showed the declining sea ice extent, the rising temperatures. "The scientists say it is because of the smoke from the factories and cars far to the south," she said. "They are changing Sela." Kaju looked out at the wounded ice. Sela, the great weather spirit, was sick. The world was out of balance, and the conversation had turned into a scream. The respectful dialogue his people had maintained for millennia was being drowned out by the actions of a distant, oblivious world. This new crisis, however, created a strange and unexpected alliance. The scientists, who had once represented the very force of external knowledge that had displaced the Inuit, now came to the elders as colleagues. They needed the Inuit Kajamajachikinjit, the Inuit traditional knowledge. The elders had decades, lifetimes of detailed observation that no satellite could match. Kaju found himself sitting in a warm room with a young, earnest biologist from Montreal. The man showed him satellite images of the sea ice. Kaju, in turn, told him what the ice in those images felt like, its texture, its strength, the sound it made. He explained how the ringed seals were having fewer pups because the snow drifts they used for their birthing layers were shallower and melted too quickly. The biologist listened, rapt, taking notes. "This is invaluable, Mr. Kaju," he said, his respect genuine. "We can't understand what's happening here without your eyes." For the first time in a long time, Kaju felt his knowledge was not a relic, but a key. It was not just about the land claim anymore. It was about the survival of the land itself. His wisdom, once on the verge of being extinguished, was now a critical tool for diagnosing a planet in crisis. The thaw was not just in the ice. It was in the rigid structures that had been imposed upon them. The government, facing the immense cost of climate change, was finally being forced to listen to the people who knew the land best. Inuit voices were being included in resource management, in policy discussions, in international climate conferences. Lena came home from one such meeting, her face flushed with a tired excitement. They listened, Ananatsiak. They actually listened. We told them that opening up new shipping lanes through the ice would scare the whales and disrupt the hunt. They're going to do an impact study based on our knowledge. It was a small victory, a fragile thing. The ice was still melting. The world was still warming. But a shift had occurred. The Inuit were no longer passive victims of change. They were becoming essential guides through the chaos. Kaja walked outside his house. The air felt different, warmer, wrong. But he also felt a different kind of warmth, a thaw within his own spirit. The hopelessness that had gripped him for so long was loosening its hold. The fight was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning, and it was a fight for the entire world. But his people were not on their knees. They were standing, armed with a wisdom the world suddenly desperately needed. The ice might be dying, but the people and their knowledge were finding a new, urgent reason to live. A new kind of boat was coming to Kanja Clinic. Not an umiak, and not a Kalunit sailing ship, but a modern research vessel, ice-strengthened and painted a stark white. It was coming to study the bowhead whale, the Arvig, whose population was slowly recovering but now faced the new threats of a warming ocean and increased ship traffic. The community was abuzz. There were jobs as guides and crew. Lena, with her fluency in both worlds, was hired as a cultural liaison, and she insisted that Kaju, despite his age, come along as a senior advisor. They have all their machines, Ananatsiak, she told him. Their hydrophones to listen, their drones to watch. But they do not have your eyes. They do not know how to think like the Arvig. The journey out onto the water was strange for Kaju. The deck was solid steel beneath his feet, not the flexible hide of the Umiak. The engine's thrum was a constant vibration, masking the subtle sounds of the sea. The scientists, in their orange flotation suits, bustled about with their equipment, their conversation a jargon of acronyms and data points. For the first few days, Kaju felt useless, a museum exhibit on a field trip. The scientists were polite but distant, their respect for him seeming theoretical. They located a small pod of bowheads using their sonar and launched a drone to get aerial footage. They recorded the whales' vocalizations, the complex, low-frequency songs that echoed through the hull of the ship. Then, one afternoon, the lead biologist, a woman named Dr. Aronson, was frustrated. "They're being elusive," she said, staring at her screens. "We can't get close enough for a biopsy dart. They seem to know we're here." Kaju, who had been sitting quietly on a crate, observing the water, spoke up. "You are too loud, and you're driving towards them head-on. You are acting like a predator." Dr. Aronson turned, surprised. "What would you suggest, Mr. Kaju?" "The Arvig is wise. It knows the shape of a killer whale, the sound of a hunting boat. You must be uninteresting." He pointed to a large ice floe drifting nearby. "Put the boat behind that. Let the ice hide you. Then be patient. Do not chase. Let them become curious about you." It was the philosophy of the SEAL hunt, applied to a multi-million-dollar research vessel. Dr. Aronson was skeptical, but she had tried everything else. She gave the order. The ship moved slowly, using the ice floe as a blind, and then cut its engines. The sudden silence was startling. For an hour, nothing happened. The scientists fidgeted, checking their watches. Kaju simply watched the water, his body still, his eyes seeing not the surface, but what lay beneath. He was listening with his Isuma, his mind heart. Then he pointed. Not where the sonar said the whales were, but 100 meters to the port side. There, she is coming to look. A moment later, the water bulged, and the immense, glossy black head of a bowhead whale broke the surface, not 50 meters from the ship. It was a female, a great, gentle giant. She exhaled a bushy, misty plume that hung in the air, carrying her fishy, ancient breath. She regarded the ship with a slow, deliberate eye, then sank back beneath the waves with a graceful flip of her fluke. The scientists were stunned. They had gotten their closest look yet. "How did you know?" Dr. Aronson asked, her voice filled with a new kind of respect. "She was silent on your machines because she was resting," Kaju explained. "But the water tells a story. The way the small waves change, the way the light reflects, it tells you something is moving deep below. And a wise old female, she is the most curious. She will come to see the strange, quiet thing behind the ice." From that moment on, Kaju was no longer a passenger. He was the guide. He taught them to read the sea as he read it. He explained that the whales often followed the edge of the pack ice, where the plankton bloom was richest. He showed them how to distinguish between a playful whale and a stressed one by the arc of its dive. He was translating the language of the hunt for a new purpose. It was not for the kill anymore, but for understanding. The biopsy dart, when it was finally successfully deployed, was not a harpoon. It was a question, a way to learn about the health of the whale, about the toxins in the water, about the story written in its blubber. On the journey home, Kaju stood at the bow, the cold wind on his face. The steel ship, the humming computers, the global mission to understand climate change. It was all part of the new world. But at its heart was an old, old skill, the ability to listen, to be patient, to respect the animal you sought. The Arvig had given his people life for centuries. Now, in a strange, circular way, his people's knowledge of the Arvig was helping to ensure its survival in a changing world. The hunt had evolved. The relationship had deepened. The conversation between the people and the giant of the frozen sea was not over. It had simply found a new vocabulary. Kaju's breath was a shallow cloud in the still, cold air of the community center. He was very old now, a landscape of wrinkles and wisdom, his body a frail vessel for a lifetime of memories. The world outside was a whirlwind of change, snowmobiles, satellite internet, climate reports. But in this room, time had condensed. He was surrounded by the future. Lena's children, his great-grandchildren, sat on a brightly colored mat before him. They were dressed in store-bought clothes, their faces illuminated by the reflected glow of the world they accessed through screens. But in this moment, their eyes were on him. In Kaju's gnarled hand, he did not hold a story knife. He held a tablet. Lena had helped him, scanning old photographs, maps from the land claim, and even a digital recording of a drum song. It was a strange tool, cold and smooth, but it held ghosts. "This," Kaju said, his voice a soft rasp that commanded the room, "is the place we call Kimiksuk." He tapped the screen, and a satellite image zoomed in on a familiar bend in the river. The children leaned in. "It means the place where the dogs drank. My father, your great-great-grandfather Itak, always stopped there. The water was sweet, and the willows were thick for the dogs to chew." He swiped, and a faded photograph appeared. Itak, young and strong, standing by a loaded Kamudiak, his dog team, resting nearby. The children gasped. The black and white image made the past tangible. And this, he continued, swiping again to bring up a map from the land claim office. Marked with traditional names is the story of the Tukterjut, the caribou. See this path? This is where the great herd would cross. We did not just take from them. We knew their path. We respected it. The land claim, this map, it is our way of telling the government this story is true. This land has a name. It has always had a name. He was tired, the effort of speaking and holding the device draining his limited strength. Lena, sitting beside him, gently took the tablet. "Let me, Ananat Siak," she whispered. She took over, but she spoke his words, telling the stories he had told her. She spoke of Sedna, not as a superstition, but as a powerful metaphor for the balance of the sea. She spoke of Sela, the weather, as a force that was now sick because the world had stopped listening. She showed them a video on the tablet, not a cartoon, but a clip of their own cousin, Sandra, speaking at a United Nations conference about Inuit knowledge and climate change. Kaju watched the children's faces. He saw not just curiosity, but a dawning recognition. They were seeing their own heritage reflected back at them, not as something shameful and primitive, but as something valuable, powerful, and relevant. The story knife had become a satellite image. The Kagik had become a global conference. The spirit of the story remained the same. One of the little girls, a bright-eyed child named after his own mother, Panic, pointed to the photograph of Itak. "Is that why we have a dog team, Ananatsiak? Even though we have a skidoo?" Kaju smiled, a slow, deep cracking of his weathered face. "The skidoo is fast," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But the dog team knows the song of the ice. It is a partner. Never forget the value of a partner." He looked around the circle at the faces of the children, at Lena, at the modern world that had tried so hard to erase them. The residential school had tried to steal their language. The government had tried to settle their spirit. The climate was now threatening their land. But they were still here. The circle was not unbroken. It was scarred, patched, and woven with new threads of law, of technology, of global awareness. But it held. The stories were being told, not in the snow of an igloo, but on the screen of a tablet in a government-built community center. The medium had changed, but the message was eternal. We are here. We belong to this land. Listen. Later, as the winter twilight settled over Kanjaklinik, Kaju sat by his window. He could hear the generator, see the lights of the houses, the faint glow of televisions. But he could also feel the immense, silent presence of the land beneath it all, waiting. He was the last of his kind, the last to have lived fully in the world of the Ilu and the Umiak. Soon, he would go the way of Atada, his spirit joining the wind and the snow. But he was no longer afraid for his people. They had passed through the long, dark night of loss and were stumbling into a new dawn. They were hunters with rifles and lawyers. They were seamstresses who used sewing machines and taught in schools. They were people using the tools of the present to protect the wisdom of the past for the sake of the future. The great saga of the Inuit was not ending. It was entering a new chapter. It was a story of resilience, not just against the elements, but against the tide of history itself. They had been bent, but they were not broken. The ice might be retreating, but the people were digging in, their roots finding purchase in the very cracks of the modern world. Kaju closed his eyes. He could almost hear it. The hiss of the kamudiak, the song of the drum, the voice of Atada in the wind, and the new, determined voices of his great-grandchildren telling the old stories in a new world. The circle was complete. The story would continue. The stone markers of the old ones stilled the tundra, silent witnesses to the passage of time. The Inuksut still stand on the skyline, their purpose now shared with cellular towers. In the settlement of Kanjaklinik, a young boy teaches his friend how to play a video game, while his grandmother, Lena, now herself an elder, teaches a classroom of children how to say bowhead whale in Inuktitut. The challenges are immense. The permafrost thaws, the cost of living is crippling, and the ghosts of the residential schools still walk among them. But something fundamental has shifted. The shame is gone, replaced by a fierce, protective pride. On the land, a hunter checks his GPS, but he also reads the snow, his knowledge a blend of the ancient and the modern. A teenager posts a TikTok video of herself drum dancing. Her movements a little awkward, but her pride unmistakable, her caption a mix of English and Inuktitut. The story of the Inuit is no longer a solitary song sung into the Arctic wind. It is a voice in the global chorus, a vital testimony in the climate crisis, a legal argument for sovereignty, a thread in the rich tapestry of human culture. They have looked into the abyss of assimilation and have chosen, instead, to adapt, to persist, to remain. They are the people. They are the hunters of the sea ice, the readers of the snow, the children of Sela. They have survived the ice, the storm, the stranger, and the long, dark night of the soul. And they are still here, their song a quiet, steady rhythm beneath the roar of the modern world, as enduring as the land itself.